right. Anyway, let's watch this video. We got a little primer about this when we rated Morph, I think this weekend sometime. And it is titled Star Citizen and Squadron 42 may have deadlines. He basically alluded that he talked to one of the hosts of the Guard Frequency podcast, who I believe is a contract lawyer and does love to follow the filings of Star Citizen's UK like public filings, right? Loves to go through the stuff and see and follow the money and see where it's going. He's one of the reasons why I know that you can't really pay attention to the way that they report their money to us, because there is some finagling going on, probably things like that. Now, I will say this. The person that Morph talks to, his name is Tony. He's the host of the Guard Frequency podcast, who has been following Star Citizen since the very beginning. One of the first Star Citizen podcasts, if not the first Star Citizen podcast in history. But over the years, many of the hosts of that show have become jaded or completely tuned out the Star Citizen altogether, with Tony being by far the most jaded and biased of the group. So Morph is talking to an expert here on, contract law and things like that, with an incredible bias against Star Citizen. So keep that in mind before we get into this. I do listen to the podcast regularly, and I often find myself yelling at the screen because they're getting everything completely wrong. They don't follow the project very closely anymore. They just like to kind of follow it when they're doing bad things, right? Never when they're doing anything okay, good, bad, whatever. It's only the bad stuff for the most part, and it's not been the greatest listen over the years. So with that long intro, let's get into the video. This is Morphologist. Star Citizen and Squadron 42 may have deadlines.
With the sudden announcement of plans for Star Citizen's full release in 1.0 and Squadron 42 going into polishing after nearly 12 years of development and almost $1 billion in funding, it may sound a bit too good to be true that this is all happening now. After all, we've heard something like this before back in 2016 when Squadron 42 was originally planned to release. So what's going on then? Well, it may just be that Star Citizen and Squadron 42 both had something like a time limit put on it thanks to a series of private investments that started back in 2018, whose terms have only now just become partially public thanks to a recent UK release of financials of the UK element of Cloud Imperium Games, the development studio behind Star Citizen and Squadron 42. And so,
all right, he'll probably get into it, but in case he doesn't, this guy, like this family, the Calders or whatever, invested, I think, like $50 million initially, got a percentage of the company when they did that. And I think they'll go into more details in this video of like actually what they got for that, because what they communicated to us was that they got some shares and they ended up on the board, right? And all of that money was for Squadron 42 advertisement. But what most of us think is at the time is that money was to keep the company alive at the moment when it wasn't looking good. This was in, I believe, the dark times, like right before 3.0, if I remember correctly, is when all that stuff started happening. Could be. I believe that was it. It was quite a bit of money. The initial one was around 50, and then they came back and did another sum, I believe. So.
In a moment, I'm going to cut through the BS and give you guys just the important details that you need to know from these UK financial documents that were just released, so you guys know how it matters for Star Citizen and Squadron 42. So if by the end you like my breakdown and you think I deserve it, please don't.
Yeah, there you go. $46 million in 2018 for 10% of the company, and 17 additional million in 2019 for another 5%. But apparently there's more to it than just the percentage.
Hit that like and subscribe button to show your support. Just as I hope that you won't forget about the generous sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, who go a step further with their threat protection service. It works against intrusive ads, malware, trackers, and malicious websites. NordVPN has become a mainstay of my channel's sponsors because I've trusted them now for years after getting sick of free VPNs that didn't work for me. Now I can access the IP-restricted websites that I need to while I'm working from abroad, which is handy for tax season, all while protecting my personal information. I also use the app on my iPad to routinely watch shows like Strange New World Season 2, which is frustratingly not available here in Taiwan. So if you're in the market for a reliable VPN service and you want to support me in another way, you can head on over to nordvpn.com/morphologist to get a huge discount on their 2-year plan, plus get an additional 4 months for free. That's nordvpn.com/morphologist, and if it doesn't work for you, you can always get your money back with their 30-day
He's way better at this than you, Mike. Thank you.
money back guarantee. Now, before I dive in, I want to thank Tony Hunter from the Guard Frequency podcast for sitting down with me and going through this document to help me better understand and analyze the information. You can find his podcast in the description down below if you're interested. He's a U.S. attorney who deals with complex contracts in the oil and gas industry and has a great deal of experience analyzing legal agreements and contracts. But keep in mind that neither of us have experience in UK financial law. Thankfully then, a good portion of this document doesn't really require any speculation, as it's pretty straightforward. Also keep in mind that both of us are Star Citizen backers, so there's going to be some bias there.
Yeah, it's just Morph's is probably a bit more balanced than his bias. So yes, I just want to make sure that that's very clear, is that his bias is like a massive hater at this point.
All right, I'm gonna keep this super simple. So part of the developers of Star Citizen are based out of the United Kingdom, where they're required to submit these reports on their finances. And those finances need to be audited by a third party. So somebody outside of CIG looks at them to verify that what they're saying is true and that they're not trying to hide anything. And if there are any discrepancies, their duty is to point them out to the government and anybody who would be interested in reading these documents. The idea is to protect us and to protect any investors so that everybody knows what's going on. The ones we're talking about today are from 2022 and
Anybody struggling with the flying? It's making me sick.
the reason why they were submitted just this year is because there was an extension given to everybody in the UK.
What's with the, is this a thing with the MK2? What's with the nose? The nose is like all over the place. I don't think it's morph. It seems like the atmosphere is like pulling the nose around.
To briefly summarize the finances, CIG is doing fine
and
according to the auditor and according to themselves. They're making a profit. They posted $8.5 million in profit.
Guys, they made $8.5 million in profit last year. Whoa.
After expenses in 2022, so they're doing pretty good.
Time
However,
for,
there was one thing that was of concern to the auditors. Page 9, if you're curious, explains that CIG didn't include all the information that the auditor was requesting about something called a contingent liability, which is referring to a series of private investments that were made back in 2018 by a group of private investors in the amount of around £27.5 million into the CIG UK entity, with an assumed reflected amount also going into the US organization. So basically, the auditors wanted to know what's going on with that investment so that they know how much CIG currently owes as a liability and what contingencies are on that liability as part of the agreement that they signed, which is why...
So is what he said that CIG did not provide that information, so nobody knows how much they owe to them? Yikes. They did, in one of the reports out to us, they did say that they paid out an X amount of millions to them.
They want to see that agreement. Tony, the lawyer I was telling you guys about, explained to me that the risks could be related to triggers within the agreement. What I'm talking about is if there are certain conditions met, say for example, performance numbers aren't satisfactory or a product isn't delivered by a certain date, it could...
Yo, okay, so this is way worse than the way Morph initially explained it to me, in terms of... It sounds way more like speculation than actual fact at this moment, because the way Morph explained it to me, it was that these triggers existed, and it sounds like we don't know if they exist at all, and we're purely speculating at this point, but let's see.
Trigger, for example, a change in the board of directors, like Chris is removed, or it could turn...
CIG has no obligation to share these details with us. No yikes there. The video is entirely speculative. Yes. Brother, they have an obligation to share it to the UK. That's like a whole thing in the UK, apparently. So they do have an obligation.
The investment into a loan, requiring that CIG pay them back within a certain time frame. So you can see then why this information would be important to an auditor to determine the health of the company. So here's where things got really interesting. CIG basically responds to this request from the auditor on page 37, where they start to outline some of the details of that contract without revealing the entire agreement. Here they outline how many shares are owned privately by these investors and how they could be calculated in value, but then they go on to reveal when exactly these amounts can be withdrawn for the company, and to be clear, this has never been revealed publicly before. They talk about how in 2024, an amount of 277.
We're just gonna leave that on the screen for 2 seconds. Here, I'll move my cam. We'll do the pause at the moment. These rights were exercisable only between the 1st of January 2024 and March 31st of 2024 for 277,500 shares, but the holder has waived their rights relating to this period. All right, so we don't have to pay them anything at this point. For the 1.6 million shares, their first put rights are exercisable between January 1st, 2025 and the 31st of March 2025 for all the 1.9 million shares between January 2028 and March 2028. Okay. So they already waived the one this year. Next year, they might be able to pull out 1.6 million shares of the total 11.7 million shares. And they have the right to put their shares back to the company for repurchase at a minimum return of 6%.
They talk about how in 2024, an amount of 277,500 shares can be withdrawn, and then in 2025, 1.6 million shares can be withdrawn, and then finally in 2028, all of the shares.
No, the total is 8.18 million owned by the investors of the 11-something million shares of the entire company.
Shares can be withdrawn.
Right? Like, am I blind here? The contingent liability exists with respect of 1.87400, which is the 1.87400 that can be there, and then there's 11.7 million issued shares for Chris and Sandy and Aaron and Ortwin and all the boys, and those are all the owners of the company. This group only owns this much. That's 15% of this is what my assumption is. So yes, you're the ones who can't
talk
read.
About how
Thank
in
you.
2024 an amount of 277,500 shares can be withdrawn.
Yeah, exactly. Where the fuck are my shares? I'm an investor. And
then in 2025, 1.6 million shares can be withdrawn. And then finally in 2028, all of the shares can be withdrawn by all investors. And I'm not using legal terminology here. I'm just trying to make this simple so that everybody can understand. So to put it simply, CIG is revealing that they have an agreement that allows the investors to withdraw portions of their money starting in 2024, leading up to 2028, where they can withdraw all of their money. But most of that money, around 85% of it, can be taken out in 2025. Now, if we do some paper napkin math here, basically CIG owes around 60 million from the UK studio if all of the shares were to be taken out. I'm talking about US dollars 60 million. And that's more money than they have on hand if you look at their financial documents. Now, at this point, you might be a little bit concerned because, as Tony explained, the way that investors extract money from a company that can't pay back an investment is by forcing bankruptcy, where the company would be forced to sell off assets in order to pay back the investors. However, CIG goes on to say that there's nothing to worry about here because, according to the contract that they signed with these investors, that if they were to request the full amount to be withdrawn, that it would, quote, be payable out of available cash in excess of that required to effectively operate the business, and thus the liability would remain undischarged until such available cash became available. Translation is...
Yeah, but how does it become available? Right? So, like, with everybody getting, like, you know, there's been some people like go, and the ship sales have gotten absolutely insane, right? I think we're trying to make money available, potentially. So, like, we started to see the signs of them getting, like, more and more ridiculous with the ship sales. So, the whole thing is that this is what's going to happen, and what sucks is 2025, Squadron 42, all of the money comes in, and they take it and go like this, right over to these fucking guys, instead of take all the money of our money that they used from Star Citizen to make Squadron 42, they're probably going to take that and just give it right over to the investors, and the investors are going to be out. And then the ship sales will continue, and then Star Citizen will get made without them, I guess. Or I think we'll hear a little bit more, because Morph touched on something when I talked to him that he hasn't touched on yet.
Is that the investors,
or they may never pull out,
can't take out any amount of money that would jeopardize the continued operation of CIG. This prevents that worst case scenario of bankruptcy and selling off assets. They further added that the investors have agreed not to exercise their option to withdraw the money in 2024, meaning that they're pretty happy with what's going on right now at CIG and they want to continue to stay invested. And just so you guys know, these investors are on the board for CIG, so they're privy to information that we're not. They see all the contract information, they see all the financials, and so they're making decisions based off of that information that we don't have. According to the document, they're also collecting royalties, so they're probably pretty happy staying invested so they can continue to collect that money.
So this was something that we were never told about, but I hope Morph shows it in the document, because again, it's all speculation until they showed the paper, right? When they show the paper, it's like, all right, we know how much these guys have in shares. We know when they're allowed to pull things out. If they are actually getting royalties on ship sales, that's kind of fucked up, because that was never something that was told to us at all. This money was going for Squadron 42 investment. That was it. And then the expectation was when Squadron 42 released, they would get their investment paid out, right? That was all. That was the way it was communicated, and that's how I understood it. But now, maybe that second 5% that happened later, that might have been this ship sale thing.
They also directly say that they have no reason to believe that they would exercise any option to withdraw cash. But here's the problem, and this is something that Tony was also concerned with. Because the full agreement was not revealed, we really don't know what leverage these investors have over CIG. Certainly, they must have something. At the very least, that option to withdraw money still exists for 2025 and 2028, and so they are definitely experiencing some kind of financial pressure to keep the investors happy. But this is really basic stuff, and it's not down to speculation. Because there's a private investment in Star Citizen, they have additional financial pressure, and this is something that we knew back in 2018 when they first announced the private investments.
Yeah, we knew basically this was when I was listening to the Guard Frequency podcast a lot more. Tony basically expressed this fear, was that, and financial pressure is a good thing, because now, do you notice there's a push to get something done for the first time ever? 323 looks kind of fun. Squadron 42 looked really good and polished, and there's probably a good reason for it. So it's not like the worst thing in the world, but it can be, right? It can be, because now when we're talking about 1.0 release, what does that look like, right? And the thing is everybody backed this game for many reasons, but one of the main reasons that I think a lot of people backed the game was that they weren't going to be pressured by somebody other than us to get it done, you know? And now that's not happening, right? So while I do believe a little bit of pressure is good, it does feel a little bit like the release of Cyberpunk or something like that, right? We need to get our investment back, and we don't care the level of the product. And it kind of is what it is, but yeah, bit of a yikes. If, again, I've seen no documentation on the screen that says that they get a percentage of ship sales. If that is the case, that is extraordinarily problematic, because they're on the board. Who makes the decisions about when these fucking patches go live? Who makes the decisions about, what ships can be sold? And who makes the decisions about what these events look like? Because the way things have been going over the last year is pretty fucking embarrassing from a video game development standpoint, because of what they're deciding is fun gameplay is literally just lining the pockets of somebody on the board, is what it looks like, right? So it's
and now we can start to make some informed inferences. The recent announcements of Squadron 42 going into polishing and Star Citizen striving towards a 1.0 commercial release now makes a lot of sense in light of that 2025 option to withdraw 85% of private investments. Well, CIG seems to be...
I mean, it's also been 12 years. So, it had to look polished at some point, right?
Pretty confident that the full amount won't be pulled out, it must be so that there's some kind of pressure that they're experiencing to deliver something. So CIG definitely is on a timeline. Even if we assume that there's nothing in that contract that triggers something extreme, even just the prospect of a small amount being withdrawn could be leverage enough to cause a problem for CIG. Imagine, for example, that it was announced that the investors pulled out just a small amount from CIG. It would make headlines. People would hear that private investors are pulling out of Star Citizen. That could affect the wider gaming community's willingness to buy ships and support further funding. So what is
They'll never stop buying ships because it's an illness.
What does this mean for Star Citizen and Squadron 42? The first and most obvious influence of this information is that Star Citizen is no longer free of any deadline. And personally, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, I'm not trying to say here that CIG have intentionally drawn this thing out longer than it needs to be.
I bought 5 ships since this video started. Thank you for your support. Appreciate it. The investors appreciate you.
Art is an iterative process, and trying to perfect something that you consider to be your life's greatest work or near to it is not something easy to accomplish, and the years are easy to get away from you. So having at least a reasonable deadline can be motivation to get the project done, to deliver something that satisfies you as well as who you're answering to. And I genuinely think that CIG wants to deliver a quality product, not just for the sake of pleasing investors, but for the massive amount of backers who've given them the money to do this project in the first.
If you actually believe, like honestly, right now, if you actually believe, after seeing everything we've seen over the last couple of years, if they are trying to deliver a product for us from the top, I think the developers who are working hard are actually trying to deliver something that's fun for us. But I do think that the people that are making the decisions, these board members and things like that, I do not believe with any ounce in my body that they give a shit at this point about delivering a good product in Star Citizen. Right? Just look at the Mark II sale. Just look at it. Just look at it. There's no way that that these people are actually a game development company or are treating this like an actual video game. There's no way. There's no way that the only gameplay requires you to buy something from the store. There's no way, right? It cannot be. And it's disappointing because Overdrive, Phase 2 is pretty cringe, but Phase 1 was pretty good. Phase 3 and 4, I think, are going to get a bit better. And there's no way that they sit there and talk about in their meetings about an initiative to make a good video game at this point when it comes to Star Citizen. That may be the case with Squadron 42. That may be the case in the near future with this whole 1.0 Richard Tyrer shit. We'll have to see. But there is no way that they sat down in the boardroom and decided that Overdrive was, fitting the expectations of what modern day gamers consider good gameplay. And they put it out there, signed off on it, and said, great job, guys. Great idea. Good video game we just created here. No, it was a fucking ship sale. That's all it was. Right? Doubt that reaches the boardroom? You're crazy. You're crazy if you don't think it does.
First place. And also don't forget, delivering quality work gets more people to give them more money, which lets them keep their job. However, there are downsides to deadlines, and that's if the deadline isn't reasonable and you don't have enough time to complete your task. This scenario can result in less than satisfactory work, and of course, that would be the concern of anybody learning this news, including myself. The good thing is, though, that CIG knew about this deadline all along. In fact, they probably are the ones that negotiated it and set it internally in the first place. So it's not like they didn't know about it since 2018. They were probably planning.
Now, I don't think that means that 1.0 is going to get rushed out. So, like, Star Citizen and Squadron 42 may have deadlines. So, is he assuming that 2028 is the 1.0 for Star Citizen? Probably a reasonable take there. And the 2025 for Squadron 42? Yeah. And I think the everything seems to fall in line that is probably pretty reasonable, right? 3 more years to deliver some gameplay after we have like the tech that's needed working to make Star Citizen should be possible if the developers are actually capable of making gameplay, which we still don't know if they are because everything's a fucking ship sale. So we'll have to see. Overdrive could have been good, but we'll never know, right? And hopefully we'll eventually know. Squadron 42 looked great in the trailers. We'll see.
On this timeline all along to start polishing Squadron at the latest in 2024 and looking at a delivery in 2025 to satisfy investors. Again, these details are not confirmed by this document, but it's pretty well implied given all the context that we have. So I'm actually less concerned about Squadron 42. It seems to me they're going to deliver a quality product. The part that concerns me is that a few years ago we saw
a lot of trailers at CitizenCon, and we're seeing a lot of those features coming into Star Citizen not looking as good as a PowerPoint presentation. So we'll see. I'm very curious what Evo looks like tonight. I'm watching this on the 27th of March. So if you guys are watching this later, there's an Evo patch for 3.23 tonight, supposedly with a lot of features in it. We'll have to see what those features actually look like, because the features that I have seen so far in 3.23 were not ready for feedback. That's for damn sure. So yeah, we'll see on all that
they were going full steam ahead on Squadron 42, shifting the majority of their resources from Star Citizen to the single-player campaign. Reflecting on this now, I wonder if they made a calculation to switch their focus to Squadron 42, thinking that this was the most likely to get across the finish line by 2025, given it's a limited single-player campaign versus a much more open-ended MMO.
I think there's probably more to it just than this like investment bullshit. I think it was probably like we cannot be developing 2 games at once anymore. It's too expensive. Right? And I think both games were hurting because of it. It's like I think that thank you, Lars, by the way. I think that there's probably a lot more to it than just this, right? There's no way that, you know, we could see how much Star Citizen suffered from the split, and we really saw how much Star Citizen suffered when almost all of the focus was on Squadron 42, right? So we'll have to see. But yeah, I think that this was probably just the best idea from a development standpoint, that somebody finally sat them down and was like, yeah, we can't keep doing this. This doesn't make sense, right? So it was just like a logical thing to do, not just like a probably good financial decision because you have to pay your investors back, right?
This theory more is the recent letter from the chairman from Chris Roberts, where he suddenly talked about Star Citizen 1.0 for the first time, coming shortly after them announcing their switch from Squadron to a Star Citizen focus. To refresh your memory, Chris in the letter talks about 1.0 as a game that is welcoming to new players, stable, and polished enough with enough gameplay and content to engage players continuously. In other words, no longer alpha or early access. Later, he then talks about how he looks at the game's future as a continuous process of adding more content. Now, this sounds to me like their plans for 1.0 are going to be narrowing things down to things that they think they can accomplish, a good baseline or foundation to start Star Citizen with before going on to basically realize the big vision they've been talking about for years. What this could mean for Star Citizen then is that we're probably not going to see 100 star systems on release.
It's not even probably. There is a 0% chance you do. He said this in 2015 that we wouldn't.
but more likely something closer to maybe 5 or 10, especially if their timeline is either 2025 or more likely 2028. It's also likely that a lot of features are going to have to wait until after that 1.0 release, and we just don't know what those are going to be. To get a better picture of what 1.0 looks like then, we're just going to have to wait until they announce that 1.0 roadmap like they talked about in that letter from the chairman. But there's a silver lining to all of this. Getting nearly 1,200 developers to refocus onto Star Citizen is likely going to yield some pretty impressive results, and we're starting to see the benefit of that with the server meshing now moving at breakneck speed. They just tested 800 players per show.
I don't think Squadron has anything to do with server meshing. Thoughts? Yeah, maybe more like break the back end, exactly. But I don't think Squadron has anything to do with server meshing. I think we will see in whatever 324 is and 325, because I don't think there's going to be a 4.0 until very end of the year, maybe beginning of next year. I think there'll probably be 2 patches before 4.0. I think in the next couple patches, we'll see how quickly they make new content, right? So 323 looks really cool, but we saw 323 in October, and they have been working on that in Squadron 42 for potentially years, some of this stuff. So breakneck speed does not exist at the moment, right? We don't know what that looks like just yet. I don't think server meshing has anything to do with it. Second, from a game development standpoint, from feature work and all sorts of things like that, FPS, locations, planets, missions, we are going to see what happens post 323. 323 is irrelevant in this conversation to some extent. Obviously, the speed at which the features will be coming in, or maybe the reason why there are so many features in 323 is because there's so many more developers on that, turning it into a multiplayer environment type of feature or whatever, right? But the idea of I don't think we will actually know the pace of what it means to have the Squadron 42 devs on Star Citizen until, at the very least, the next patch after 323. And even then, many of those features will likely be things that we saw at CitizenCon, right? Or updates to the features that they added in 323. So, talk to me when we're adding long-distance probing. Talk to me when we're adding entirely new mission types. Talk to me when we're adding Bounty Hunter 2.0. Talk to me when we're adding crafting. Talk to me when we're adding base building. Things that have nothing to do with Star Citizen or Squadron and are only Star Citizen related. Then we'll actually see the pace that the change makes, right? So we just don't know any of those things yet. And I think it's a bit unreasonable to expect 323-like features every patch, even though Richard Tyrer said we should expect that. I don't believe him yet, and I will believe him after they do it, right? I think there was a lot of speculation that base building would be in 323. So far, we haven't seen or anything like that. That would be an example of that. If that was actually the case or actually true, that would be sick, right? And that would kind of prove that bringing a lot of these people over is meaningful. But as far as we know, that shit is non-existent and was just a meme,
Shard just this past weekend. So then, regardless of whether or not we get the roadmap sooner or later for 1.0, the real test of whether or not they can pull off a really complete version of Star Citizen for that first...
You need crafting and basic economy for base building first? No, you don't. Just for them to test us using the feature, right? Not necessarily. It's sad. For it to be fun, you're absolutely right. But it doesn't have to be fun.
First release will probably come when we see what happens after the release of the next patch, 3.23, which contains mostly ported...
When is 323 launch? it's not a meal, but lunch is usually around noon. Now, 323's launch, nobody knows.
Features from Squadron 42. After all these team members switch over from Squadron to Star Citizen, we should see an acceleration, and how we can tell if an acceleration has actually happened is if the patch following 323 is also equally as big. So
damn, morphs on it.
How do you guys interpret this information? Is it good news? Is it bad news? Let me know down below. Personally, I'm still feeling positive about this year for Star Citizen, and I think it's still going to be the biggest year yet. But that's it for now, guys. I'll provide a link.
What do you think? Good news or bad news? I think it's probably bad news, to be honest. But it was always bad news because they brought on investors.
Link in the description.
When they said that, you know, they're a crowdfunded game. They're not. They're not anymore. And they haven't been for a while. Because then things like this happen.
Below.
Yeah, it's kind of no news in a lot of ways.
Again, to that document if you'd like to review it for yourself.
The only news would have been if they are actually getting a percentage of ship sales, then that does dictate why the ship sales are so malicious at times.
Fly safe out there. See you in the next one.
Thanks for the video, Morph. I mean, that's something different than we've, you know, the typical Star Citizen videos out there. I thought it was pretty good. I don't think what was good there is we didn't really get to see or hear any of the bias from Tony, because I think that would have been bad. And I think that would have turned people off to what was going on there. So just like putting the document on the screen was the right choice there for sure. Because I think Tony would have put people off that are fans of the game, and I think it was just informative for the most part. Again, the only thing is the percentage of ship sales. There was no proof there. It seemed speculative, but I think it's both good and bad. I think a little bit of pressure for Chris is a good thing, but I think we get a worse product for it, and I'm not sure that's why people back this game. I think, you know, if you read a lot of posts from people, and maybe they are the loud minority. A lot of people say that they back this game because no publisher, and it'll be done when it's done, and you don't know game development. You know, those types. There's a lot of those posts, and I don't think, you know, I would say 95% of them are not memes. You know what I mean? People actually believe this stuff. So they backed something that they thought was different. And what this video tells you is that they're no different than anybody else. So, you know, they claim to be, but we've seen their actions over the years. They're just like everyone else at this point, right? They got too big, and now look at them. And yeah, maybe in some ways they're worse. I don't think so. That's my opinion. I don't believe they're worse. But in some ways, yeah, they're pretty bad. They're pretty damn bad. So, yeah. Yikes.